The morning that would change everything arrived shrouded in white. September in the Lorraine region had brought with it a fog so thick that visibility shrank to mere yards, and in that ghostly whiteness 300 German armoured vehicles prowled forward like wolves seeking prey. These weren't ordinary tanks. These were Panthers, the pride of the Reich's engineering prowess, sleek predators crafted with one purpose in mind: to destroy everything that stood before them. Their thick frontal plating could shrug off most Allied shells, and their long-barreled guns possessed the reach to kill at distances where enemy fire couldn't even scratch their paint. The crews inside these steel beasts had been promised they would deliver a knockout blow, that they would drive the Americans back and prove once more that German armour was unmatched. On the receiving end of this impending storm sat American crews in their Shermans, machines that had earned an unfortunate reputation among their own soldiers. The Sherman's armour was thin by comparison, its gun considered inadequate against the heavy German tanks. In a straight duel at range, a Panther could punch through a Sherman's front plate from 2,000 yards away, while the American tank's shells would simply ricochet off the German armour like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. The mathematics were cruel and simple. In a head-to-head fight, the Sherman seemed doomed to lose. Every American tanker climbing into his vehicle understood this reality, felt it in his gut each time he buttoned up the hatch. Yet when the battle finally ended and someone took stock of the carnage littering those French fields, the wreckage told a story that defied all expectations. The battlefield wasn't filled with burning American tanks. Instead, German armour lay scattered and destroyed, twisted metal monuments to a defeat so complete it would echo through the remainder of the war. The supposed inferior tank, manned by determined crews who refused to accept their apparent disadvantage, had achieved one of the most lopsided victories the Western Front would witness. The question that haunted observers then, and historians since, was straightforward yet profound. How did men in weaker machines manage to shatter an armoured force that should have swept them aside? To understand what transpired in those fog-shrouded fields, you have to journey back through the months that led to that September morning. The summer of 1944 had witnessed the Allies tear a gaping hole in German defences across Normandy. What followed was a pursuit, a rolling advance that saw Allied armour streaming across France at speeds that surprised even the commanders directing the offensive. The Wehrmacht, that once seemingly invincible military machine that had conquered most of Europe, found itself in full retreat, falling back toward the borders of the fatherland itself. German soldiers who had marched west years earlier as conquerors now stumbled east as defeated men, abandoning equipment, losing cohesion, watching their defensive lines collapse one after another. But the madman directing Germany's war from his distant headquarters refused to acknowledge what his generals could plainly see. He would not accept retreat as permanent, would not concede that the tide had turned irreversibly against him. Instead, he demanded a counter-offensive, a massive armoured strike that would halt the Allied momentum and perhaps, in his increasingly detached mind, reverse the entire course of the campaign. The region he selected for this showdown was Lorraine, a piece of northeastern France that had witnessed countless battles throughout history. Its landscape of rolling hills, dense forests and river valleys had been fought over by French and Germans for generations, stained with blood from wars stretching back centuries. But Lorraine's value in 1944 extended beyond mere geography or historical symbolism. Just beyond this region lay the Saar, Germany's industrial heartland, the factories and mines that fed the war machine. If American forces broke through in Lorraine, the road into Germany itself would lie open, exposed and vulnerable. This could not be permitted. The German High Command assembled what they could for this counter-offensive, scraping together armoured units from wherever reserves could be found. The 5th Panzer Army, placed under the command of Hasso von Manteuffel, would deliver the blow. Von Manteuffel was a capable officer, but even he understood the challenges he faced. The German armoured forces of late 1944 bore little resemblance to the mighty panzer divisions that had rolled across Poland and France years earlier. The Eastern Front had devoured Germany's best formations, consuming experienced crews and irreplaceable veterans in the endless meat grinder of combat against Soviet forces. What remained in the West was a shadow force, padded out with hastily trained replacements and new formations created on paper more than in substance. During that summer, German leadership had authorized the creation of new panzer brigades, units assembled quickly to plug the gaps in the crumbling front. These brigades received Germany's newest and most fearsome tank, the Panther, but the men assigned to crew these sophisticated machines had barely finished their training. Many had never fired their main gun in combat, had never coordinated with other tanks in a real battle, had never experienced the chaos and terror of armoured warfare against a determined enemy. They were green troops handed veteran weapons, inexperience wrapped in advanced technology. The contrast with their American opponents couldn't have been starker. By September 1944, the men of Patton's Third Army had been through the crucible. They'd landed in Normandy and fought through the murderous hedgerow country, where every field became a killing ground and every sunken lane a potential ambush site. They'd learned their trade in blood and fire, absorbing lessons that no training ground could teach. The 4th Armoured Division, which would bear the brunt of the coming German assault, was commanded by Major General John Wood, and his tankers had been training together since 1941. 3 years of working as a unit, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, developing the kind of cohesion that only time can build. When they rolled into Lorraine that September, they were veterans in the truest sense, men who had seen combat and survived it, who had adapted and improved with each engagement. American doctrine had evolved considerably from the early days of the war. The US Army had learned, sometimes painfully, that individual tanks couldn't win battles alone. Victory required combined arms, the integration of infantry, artillery, armour, engineers, and increasingly air power, all working in concert like instruments in an orchestra. Tanks supported infantry advances, infantry protected tanks from enemy anti-tank teams, artillery softened up defensive positions before either advanced, and aircraft struck targets beyond the reach of ground forces. This philosophy had been refined in North Africa, tested in Italy, and perfected in France. By the autumn of 1944, American forces had turned combined arms warfare into something approaching an art form. The German approach remained rooted in earlier thinking, the belief that concentrated armour could achieve decisive breakthroughs if employed with sufficient mass and determination. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in the early war years, when German panzers had torn through Poland in weeks and smashed France in 6. But circumstances had changed profoundly since those heady days of Blitzkrieg. Germany no longer possessed the fuel to sustain long-range armoured operations, no longer had the air superiority that once allowed their tanks to operate without fear from above, no longer could count on facing opponents who would break and run at the first sight of panzers. Yet the doctrine persisted, perhaps because acknowledging its obsolescence would mean confronting the reality of Germany's deteriorating position. So when von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army prepared to strike in Lorraine, it did so following a playbook written years earlier in a different war, against different enemies, under different conditions. The plan called for massed armoured formations to punch through American lines, recapture the town of Lunéville, sever Patton's supply lines, and drive the Americans back across the Moselle River. On paper, with 300 tanks concentrated for the assault, it looked formidable. In reality, it was a plan conceived in desperation and divorced from the capabilities of the forces available to execute it. The Americans facing this threat operated under their own constraints. Patton's rapid advance across France had stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every replacement part had to be trucked hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches. Worse still, from Patton's perspective, the Supreme Allied Command had made the decision to prioritise Field Marshal Montgomery's advance in the north, funneling the limited supplies available in Europe to support the British drive toward the Rhine. This left Patton's Third Army perpetually short of what it needed, forced to husband resources carefully and make do with less than its commander wanted. Tankers joked bitterly that they spent more time waiting for fuel than fighting Germans, that their Shermans were more likely to be halted by empty tanks than enemy fire. Yet within these constraints, American forces developed an approach that turned scarcity into an advantage of sorts. Knowing they couldn't rely on overwhelming material superiority, they emphasized what they had in abundance: well-trained crews, effective coordination, and the flexibility to adapt tactics to circumstances. When artillery ammunition ran short, they learned to make each barrage count, calling down fire with precision rather than saturation. When fuel was scarce, they positioned their tanks carefully rather than maneuvering constantly, turning potential mobility into the patience of a hidden ambush. And because American tankers knew their Shermans couldn't survive frontal duels with Panthers, they became experts at avoiding such encounters, striking from the flank, using terrain for concealment, coordinating with other arms to create situations where American advantages could overcome German ones. The machines themselves told much of the story. Two different philosophies of armoured warfare made manifest in steel. The Panther had been born from trauma, from the shock German forces experienced when they first encountered Soviet T-34s on the Russian steppes. The T-34's combination of sloped armour, wide tracks for cross-country mobility, and a powerful gun had been a revelation, demonstrating that German tank design had fallen behind. The response was the Panther, a medium tank that incorporated lessons learned in the East. Its frontal armour was thick and heavily sloped, designed to deflect incoming rounds rather than simply absorbing them through sheer thickness. The long-barreled 75mm gun it mounted could penetrate virtually any Allied tank at combat ranges, giving it reach that American tankers could only envy. From a purely technical standpoint, the Panther represented some of the finest engineering Germany could produce. But engineering excellence on the drawing board didn't always translate to battlefield effectiveness. The Panther was a complex machine, demanding constant maintenance, burning through fuel at an alarming rate, and prone to mechanical breakdowns that left supposedly fearsome tanks sitting broken on the side of roads. Its sophisticated suspension system required careful handling. Its transmission had a tendency to fail under stress, and its engine, while powerful, was temperamental and hungry. In the hands of experienced crews who understood its quirks and could perform the necessary maintenance, the Panther was indeed fearsome. But the green crews manning these tanks in Lorraine lacked that experience, and many would discover that their vaunted Panthers could betray them as readily as protect them. The Sherman represented an entirely different design philosophy. Where the Panther pursued technical excellence, the Sherman emphasized reliability, ease of production, and operational simplicity. American factories churned out Shermans by the tens of thousands, a production rate that German industry couldn't hope to match. The Sherman was designed to be shipped anywhere in the world, maintained with common tools by mechanics of average skill, and operated by crews with reasonable but not exceptional training. Its 75mm gun, in its standard configuration, lacked the penetrating power of German weapons, a deficiency American tankers were all too aware of. Its armour was thinner than what protected German heavy tanks. By the metrics of one-on-one tank combat, the Sherman appeared outclassed. Yet this missed the point of its design. The Sherman wasn't meant to win tank duels through superior armour and firepower. It was meant to be part of a system, a component in the combined arms team. It didn't need to be the best tank on the battlefield if it could be part of the best overall force, supported by artillery that could smash German positions, infantry that could clear threats, and aircraft that could strike from above. The Sherman's real advantages lay in its reliability, which meant American tanks were more likely to be running when needed, and in its numbers, which meant American forces could be everywhere at once while German tanks were concentrated in a few places. For crews who had learned how to employ the Sherman effectively, using its mobility and working within the combined arms framework, it became a weapon that could achieve victory despite its apparent weaknesses. By mid-September, as both sides moved into position around Lorraine, the stage was set for a clash that would test these competing visions of armoured warfare. The Germans brought superior individual tanks but inexperienced crews, a plan that assumed armour alone could achieve decisive results, and a logistical situation that grew more desperate by the day. The Americans brought inferior individual tanks but veteran crews, a doctrine that emphasized teamwork and combined arms, and just enough supplies to sustain defensive operations, if not a continued offensive. The fields and villages of Lorraine, places with names that few Americans had heard before, and most would struggle to pronounce, were about to become the proving ground where these differences would be settled in fire and steel. In the days immediately before the battle, Lorraine took on an eerie calm, the quiet before the inevitable storm. American units spread out across the countryside, occupying positions that seemed scattered and vulnerable to anyone looking at a map without understanding the defensive scheme behind them. Small outposts of infantry and engineers held villages and crossroads, backed up by clusters of Sherman tanks positioned in carefully selected spots where they could cover approaches without being easily spotted themselves. Tank destroyers, thinly armoured but mounting powerful guns, were dug into concealed positions where their low profile made them nearly invisible until they opened fire. At night, American patrols moved through the darkness, listening for the sounds of German movement, gathering intelligence and maintaining the kind of aggressive presence that kept an enemy off balance. For the men manning these positions, the waiting was an ordeal in itself. Combat, for all its terror, at least provided the clarity of action, something to do, decisions to make, the awful but simple focus of survival. Waiting offered nothing but time to think, to worry, to imagine what might be coming. Tankers performed endless maintenance on their Shermans, checking and rechecking systems that had already been verified multiple times. They wrote letters home, trying to find words that would reassure families without lying about the dangers they faced. They brewed coffee on the engine decks of their tanks, the hot metal serving as an impromptu stove. They told jokes, shared rumours, and tried to maintain the spirits of men who knew something large was brewing but couldn't say when or where it would break. The Sherman became more than just a vehicle to these men. It was home, shelter, and lifeline all rolled into one. Crews personalised their tanks, painting names and nose art on the hulls, adding small touches that made an anonymous piece of military equipment into something uniquely theirs. Some tucked photographs behind instrument panels, images of wives or girlfriends or children, reminders of what waited for them if they could just survive long enough to go home. Others carved initials into metal surfaces or hung lucky charms from periscopes. The interior of a Sherman was cramped, uncomfortable, filled with hard edges and the overwhelming smell of oil and gunpowder and unwashed men living in close quarters, but it represented safety of a sort. Steel walls between vulnerable flesh and a hostile world. Men developed intimate relationships with their machines, learning every quirk and characteristic, knowing from the sound of the engine whether something was wrong, developing an almost instinctive feel for their tank's capabilities and limitations. In the close confines of a Sherman's crew compartment, 5 men formed bonds that went beyond ordinary friendship, their lives depending on each other in the most literal way possible. The loader had to keep shells moving to the gun. The gunner had to aim and fire accurately under pressure. The driver had to maneuver the tank effectively while unable to see much beyond his limited viewport. The assistant driver handled the bow machine gun and helped navigate, and the tank commander had to make the decisions that kept everyone alive. When the crew worked well together, these 5 men became a single efficient organism. When they didn't, they died. Rumours spread through the American ranks like wildfire in those tense days. Soldiers always knew when something was coming, could feel it in the air, in the way officers behaved, in the sudden increase in preparedness orders. Pilots flying reconnaissance missions reported glimpses of German armour moving into positions across the lines, columns of tanks spotted briefly before disappearing into tree cover or behind terrain features. But the weather had turned foul, with clouds settling over Lorraine like a blanket, grounding aircraft and limiting what could be observed from above. When American patrols ventured forward, they occasionally bumped into German scouts, brief violent encounters in the fog that left bodies behind but answered few questions about what was gathering in the mist. Each small skirmish felt like a warning tremor, the kind of ground shake that precedes an earthquake. Commanders passed down orders for their units to prepare for a major attack, to stockpile ammunition, to register artillery coordinates for likely approach routes, to check and double-check that communication lines were functioning. The men complied, going through motions that had become routine, but knowing that this time felt different, heavier with consequence. The night of September 17th brought steady rain, water drumming on tank hulls and turning roads into mud. Inside their Shermans, American tankers listened to the sound, a constant metallic percussion that made conversation difficult and sleep nearly impossible. Some men sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts, facing the reality that tomorrow or the next day might be their last. Others maintained nervous chatter, talking about anything and everything to avoid thinking about what was coming. Veterans, men who had been through combat before, recognized the sounds in the distance, faint but unmistakable to experienced ears. Engines, lots of engines, the deep throaty rumble of heavy vehicles on the move. The newer men asked what that sound was, and the veterans told them, their voices matter of fact, that it was German armor forming up for an attack. The knowledge sat heavy in the darkness, undeniable and unavoidable. Morning would bring battle, and each man would discover whether he had what it took to survive it. Dawn on September 18th arrived hidden behind fog so dense it seemed almost solid. Visibility dropped to nothing, leaving men effectively blind beyond a few paces. American tankers sat in their positions, straining their ears since their eyes were useless, listening for any indication of what was happening beyond their tiny bubble of visible space. Radio chatter remained subdued, voices tight with tension, as outposts reported contact and then went silent, leaving officers to piece together a picture of the battle from fragments of information. Then, cutting through the white nothingness, came the sound every tanker had learned to dread. The distinctive growl of German tank engines growing steadily louder, getting closer with each passing second. The 113th Panzer Brigade was advancing, confident that the fog concealed their approach, expecting to catch the Americans unprepared and vulnerable. Their commanders had planned a dawn assault, counting on surprise and overwhelming force to shatter the American defences before coordinated resistance could form. Panther tanks pushed forward in formation, their commanders unable to see much but trusting that their armour would protect them from whatever lay ahead, that their guns would destroy any opposition before it became a threat. Supporting them came Panzer Grenadiers, infantry trained to work with armour, and assault guns meant to provide additional firepower. It looked formidable, felt unstoppable, and the German crews believed they were about to deliver the crushing blow their leaders had promised. But the fog that concealed the German advance also hid the American response. Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division wasn't scattered and confused as the Germans expected. They were positioned, ready, waiting with the patience of experienced hunters who had set their trap and now needed only for their prey to walk into it. The night before, patrols had detected German movements, had reported the information up the chain of command, and officers had quietly repositioned forces to meet the threat. Shermans moved to new locations under cover of darkness, tank destroyers shifted to spots where they had clear fields of fire along likely approaches, artillery plotted coordinates and prepared ammunition. When morning came, American forces were as ready as they could be, given the limitations of the fog. They couldn't see the Germans coming any better than the Germans could see them, but they knew where to expect the attack, and that knowledge made all the difference. The first Panthers to emerge from the mist were like ghost ships appearing from clouds, dark shapes that materialized suddenly out of the white void. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, both sides could see each other. American tankers staring at the massive German tanks that had appeared at what should have been impossible range, German crews shocked to find Shermans positioned directly in their path when they expected to be advancing through empty territory. Then that frozen instant shattered into violence. American guns opened fire at ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than thousands, close enough that even the Sherman's 75mm gun could punch through Panther armor when it struck the side plates rather than the heavily protected front. The fog that was supposed to be Germany's ally became their betrayer, forcing the Panthers into knife-fighting distances, where American crews could exploit every weakness in German armor schemes. Within the first chaotic minutes of engagement, 11 German tanks were burning, their crews dead or bailing out into a maelstrom of fire. Black smoke began to curl upward from destroyed vehicles, adding to the confusion and marking the battlefield with pillars of oily darkness that rose above the fog. The sound was overwhelming, the crash of tank guns firing, the scream of shells in flight, the metallic clang of hits, the deeper whoomph of ammunition cooking off inside destroyed tanks, the desperate shouting of men trying to coordinate under conditions where visibility was measured in yards. German crews, many experiencing their first real combat, found themselves fighting blind, unable to coordinate with neighbouring tanks, unsure where friendly forces were positioned, struggling to even identify targets before those targets fired first. The carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos, formations breaking apart as individual tank commanders made their own decisions, some pressing forward trying to break through, others pulling back seeking better positions or simply survival. The Panthers had numbers on their side, and they had the kind of armour that should have given them a decisive advantage. 4 companies of these fearsome tanks pushed forward, their commanders believing that sheer mass and determination could overcome the initial shock and carry them through the American positions. The ground itself seemed to shake with their advance, the weight of so much steel concentrated in such a small area. Supporting them came panzer grenadiers on foot and in half-tracks, assault guns adding their firepower to the mix, all the components of an armoured assault as German doctrine prescribed it. Yet despite the impressive array of force, despite following the tactical playbook that had worked so well in earlier years, the German advance couldn't punch through. American tankers fought with the kind of disciplined flexibility that training and experience had instilled in them. When a position became untenable, they pulled back to the next prepared location. When an opportunity appeared, they struck hard and fast before melting away again. They used every fold in the terrain, every building, every hedge and ditch to gain advantage, understanding that in this fight, mobility and cunning mattered more than thickness of armour. Tank commanders talked constantly on their radios, sharing information about German positions, coordinating movements, calling for artillery support when concentrations of enemy armour appeared. The combined arms system that American doctrine emphasized was functioning exactly as intended, different pieces of the military machine working together to create effects greater than the sum of their parts. Near the village of Leasey, American tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had positioned themselves in carefully selected spots, their thin armour and low profile making them nearly invisible when dug into defensive positions. These weren't tanks in the traditional sense, they were purpose-built vehicles mounting powerful guns on lightly armoured chassis designed to hide and ambush enemy armour rather than engaging in mobile combat. The crews manning these vehicles understood their role perfectly. They needed to strike first and hard, because if German tanks spotted them and returned fire, the destroyers' thin armour wouldn't save them. As Panthers advanced through the fog, confident in their armour and firepower, the tank destroyers waited in silence, crews barely breathing, fingers tense on triggers. The Germans came on, blind to the threat, pushing forward through terrain they hadn't properly reconnoitred. When the distance closed to barely 150 yards, practically point-blank range for armoured combat, the tank destroyers opened fire. The engagement was brutal and short. American guns barked, armour-piercing shells streaked across the tiny gap separating hunter from hunted, and Panthers began to die. 3 tank destroyers were destroyed in the exchange, German return fire finding targets and proving that even lightly armoured vehicles could kill if they struck first. But before those 3 American vehicles were knocked out, they had destroyed 7 Panthers, nearly a full platoon of German tanks eliminated in seconds. The wreckage of both sides smouldered together in the fog, steel carcasses that would sit there for days afterward, silent testimony to how quickly armoured combat could turn deadly. As the day wore on, the German attack began to lose its momentum. The initial surprise was gone, spent in the first violent clashes. American defences had held, bent but not broken, and now the defenders understood what they faced and how to counter it. By evening, when officers on both sides took stock of the day's fighting, the tallies told a grim story for the Germans. 50 tanks destroyed or abandoned, roughly half the strength of the 113th Panzer Brigade wiped out in a single day of combat. American losses, while not insignificant, were a fraction of what the Germans had suffered. For the first time on the Western Front, the myth of the Panther as an invincible superweapon had been thoroughly shattered. The tanks that were supposed to dominate the battlefield, that German propaganda had praised as war winners, lay scattered across French fields as burning wrecks. The inexperience of German crews had proven catastrophic, their unfamiliarity with their vehicles and with combat itself turning sophisticated machines into mobile coffins. The lack of proper reconnaissance meant they had advanced blind into prepared American positions. The rigid adherence to planned attacks, rather than adapting to battlefield realities, had compounded every other mistake. And the Americans, despite supposedly inferior tanks, despite limited supplies, had fought with the kind of coordinated professionalism that only training and experience could produce. The pattern established on September 19th repeated itself in the days that followed, each engagement adding to the mounting German disaster. On the 20th, German forces struck again, this time aiming directly at Aracourt itself and the headquarters positions of Combat Command A. For a brief period, the situation looked dangerous for the Americans. Panthers pushing hard enough that headquarters personnel found themselves under direct fire, falling back before the German advance. Staff officers grabbed weapons and prepared to defend themselves. Maps were hastily gathered, communications equipment disconnected and loaded for evacuation if it came to that. Then salvation arrived from the most unexpected quarter. High above the battlefield, almost invisible in the clouds, flew a tiny Piper Cub observation aircraft. These light planes normally served as artillery spotters, flying low and slow to direct fire from the big guns. But the Piper Cub diving toward the German tanks was no ordinary observer. It was piloted by Major Charles Carpenter, and strapped to its wings were bazookas, infantry anti-tank weapons that Carpenter had jury-rigged into an improvised aerial rocket system. He called his armed cub Rosie the Rocketer, and was about to demonstrate that even the smallest weapon could terrify men in the mightiest tanks. Carpenter dove at the advancing Panthers with reckless courage, the little cub approaching speeds it was never designed for as he pushed it into a near-vertical dive. At what seemed like suicidally close range, he fired his bazookas, rockets streaking down toward the German armour. The results were immediate and devastating. 2 Panthers took direct hits and were knocked out, their crews bailing from vehicles that were suddenly death traps. Several armoured cars accompanying the tanks were destroyed, their lighter armour no match for the rockets. But more importantly, Carpenter's attack created panic among the German infantry supporting the assault. Panzer grenadiers scattered, diving for cover, unable to comprehend this new threat attacking them from above in a plane barely larger than a car. Carpenter wasn't done. He pulled up, flew back to the American lines, landed, and had his ground crew reload the bazookas while he briefed them on what he'd seen. Then he took off again, flying 2 more sorties that day, ultimately launching 16 rockets total at the German formations. By the time evening fell, his tiny unarmed observation plane had accounted for more destroyed German vehicles than some entire tank platoons. His actions broke the German attack, buying time for American defences to reorganise and counterattack, and his courage became legend among the men of the 4th Armoured Division. September 21st brought a change that doomed what remained of German hopes. The weather cleared. After days of fog and clouds that had grounded Allied aircraft and given German ground forces at least some protection from air attack, the skies suddenly opened. Visibility extended for miles, the sun broke through, and with it came retribution from above. P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command, robust fighter bombers that pilots affectionately called Jugs, roared over the battlefield in wave after wave. These aircraft carried rockets, bombs, and heavy machine guns, and their pilots had been waiting impatiently for weather that would let them rejoin the fight. Now they fell on the exposed German columns with savage enthusiasm. The Panthers that had seemed so fearsome on the ground were helpless against attack from above. Their thick frontal armour meant nothing when rockets struck the thin top plates. Their powerful guns couldn't elevate enough to threaten fast-moving aircraft. German crews could only button up their hatches and pray that the bombs falling around them would miss, that the rockets screaming down wouldn't find them, that their luck would hold just a little longer. For many, it didn't. The Thunderbolts came in low, their 850 caliber machine guns hammering any target that presented itself, destroying soft-skinned vehicles, shredding infantry caught in the open and adding their weight to the artillery and tank fire already pounding German positions. For soldiers who had survived the ground fighting, the air attacks were the final straw. There was no defense against aircraft, no way to fight back, nothing to do but endure and hope. Morale, already shaken by the unexpectedly fierce American resistance, began to crumble completely under this aerial onslaught. The climactic day came on September 22nd. German commanders, refusing to acknowledge that their offensive had failed, gathered what strength remained and ordered one final major push. This attack came north of Aracourt, hitting American cavalry units that were more lightly equipped than the armoured formations they'd been facing. The cavalry bore the brunt of the initial assault, outgunned and outnumbered, trading space for time as they fell back in as good order as circumstances allowed. But they held long enough, buying precious minutes for heavier American forces to respond. Shermans and tank destroyers rushed to the threatened sector, taking up positions that would allow them to hit the German advance from the flanks. Once again, morning fog initially concealed German movements, but this time the Americans were ready for it, understanding how to use it rather than being blinded by it. As Panthers pushed forward, believing themselves hidden, the fog began to lift. It was like a curtain being raised on a stage, suddenly revealing the German tanks to the full fury of American firepower. Artillery that had been waiting for coordinates fired mission after mission, high-explosive shells screaming down onto German positions. Tank destroyers opened up from concealed positions, their powerful guns finding targets at ranges where return fire was difficult. The Shermans, positioned in depth rather than in a single line, struck from multiple directions, forcing German crews to choose which threats to engage, while others fired unmolested. And overhead, with clear skies, the Thunderbolts returned to add their weight to the carnage. The battlefield transformed into an inferno of fire and steel, smoke rising in black columns that could be seen for miles, the thunder of explosions rolling across the countryside in a continuous roar that drowned out individual sounds. Panthers that had survived previous days' fighting now burned where they stood, their crews dead at their posts or fleeing into the countryside. Panzer grenadiers fell in windows, caught in open ground with no cover, cut down by machine gun fire and artillery fragments. Command and control broke down completely as radio operators died and radios were destroyed, leaving individual units fighting in isolation without orders or support. By the time dusk fell, the 110th Panzer Brigade had been shattered as thoroughly as the 113th before it. German forces that had attacked with such confidence that morning were now in full retreat, survivors stumbling back toward their own lines, leaving behind them a landscape littered with destroyed equipment and dead comrades. American forces, sensing the collapse, launched counterattacks that rolled up what remained of German positions. Units that had been defending for days suddenly found themselves advancing, pushing forward into territory the Germans had held that morning, capturing equipment and prisoners. The initiative had shifted completely. What had begun as a German offensive meant to drive the Americans back had transformed into an American victory so complete that German forces in the sector would need weeks to recover, if they ever truly did. One American unit in particular earned itself a reputation during these desperate days of fighting. The 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, fought with a skill and aggressiveness that became legendary. From September 19th through the 22nd, Abrams' Shermans were everywhere the fighting was hardest, appearing from unexpected directions, striking hard, then disappearing before German forces could respond effectively. At Mary-aux-Chênes, his battalion engaged superior numbers of Panthers and somehow emerged victorious despite losing 14 Shermans in the fighting. But those 14 American losses were more than offset by the destruction of 55 German tanks, a kill ratio that defied every expectation of how Sherman versus Panther engagements should go. Abrams himself led from the front, his tank often the first into combat, his voice on the radio coordinating his battalion with a clarity and decisiveness that inspired his men and confounded the enemy. Stories about Abrams spread through the division, tales of how he seemed to always know where the Germans would be, how his battalion struck like lightning and vanished like smoke, how following Abrams into combat was terrifying but somehow safer than being anywhere else. His name became synonymous with aggressive, intelligent armoured combat, and the reputation he built at Aracourt would follow him through the rest of the war and into the years beyond. By September 25th, the German offensive had completely collapsed. Scattered attacks still occurred, Panthers and other vehicles making desperate thrusts that accomplished nothing except adding to the toll of destroyed equipment. Fuel shortages that had plagued German operations from the start now became critical, with tanks sitting immobile for lack of gasoline, unable to advance or even retreat effectively. Ammunition that had been expended freely in the early days of fighting was now rationed carefully, and there wasn't enough of it regardless. Morale, that intangible but crucial element of military effectiveness, had disintegrated entirely. German soldiers who had been told they were about to deliver a war-winning blow now understood they had been fed lies, that the offensive had failed catastrophically, that they were part of a defeated force. The retreat, when it finally came, was less an organised withdrawal than a rout, with units falling back in disorder, abandoning equipment they couldn't move, leaving wounded behind because there was no way to evacuate them. The fields around Aracourt, which had been farmland and forest just days before, now resembled a scrapyard of military equipment. Destroyed Panthers sat where they'd been killed, some burned out completely, others merely disabled, all of them testament to the failure of Germany's last major armoured offensive in the west before the Ardennes. The final accounting made grim reading for German commanders. 285 tanks and armoured vehicles destroyed, losses that couldn't be replaced in any meaningful time frame. Entire brigades wiped out, their cadres scattered, their combat effectiveness reduced to zero. Against this catastrophic toll, American losses amounted to 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers, a disparity so large it seemed almost unbelievable. The fog that was supposed to have concealed the German advance had instead turned the battlefield into a killing ground where American ambushes could work perfectly. Superior German armour and firepower had proven worthless without the training to employ them effectively, without adequate reconnaissance, without the fuel and supplies to sustain operations, without the air cover that might have evened the odds. Against disciplined veterans using combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry and artillery and armour and air power into a seamless whole, the Panthers had fallen one after another until the wreckage piled so high it seemed impossible for even more to have been destroyed. Aracourt established beyond any doubt that the decisive factor in armoured combat wasn't the thickness of armour or the reach of guns. It was the quality of crews, the soundness of tactics, and the ability to adapt to battlefield realities. The Germans had brought better individual tanks, but inferior everything else, and the everything else had proven more important. For the men who had fought there, both American and German, Aracourt would remain seared into memory for the rest of their lives. American tankers would remember the fog, the sudden violent clashes at ranges so close they could see German crewmen through vision blocks, the terror of knowing their armour couldn't save them if they made mistakes, and the grim satisfaction of watching supposedly invincible Panthers burn. German survivors would remember the chaos, the confusion, the feeling of being hunted rather than hunting, the realization that their training had been inadequate and their leaders had sent them into a battle they weren't prepared to win. The villages and farms of Lorraine slowly returned to some semblance of normality once the fighting moved on, but the scars remained visible for years. Craters from artillery shells pocked fields where crops should have grown. The blackened hulks of destroyed tanks sat rusting where they'd been killed until salvage crews eventually hauled them away. Farmers ploughing their fields after the war would occasionally unearth unexploded shells or other reminders of those violent September days. The aftermath of Aracourt rippled outward in ways both immediate and long-lasting. For Germany's military, the defeat represented another nail in the coffin of the once-feared Panzerwaffe. Each destroyed Panther was a loss that factories struggling under Allied bombing couldn't easily replace. Each killed or captured crew member was experience and training vanished, impossible to recover in a nation that was running short of men and time. The resources consumed in the failed Lorraine offensive, the fuel burned, the ammunition expended, the vehicles lost, all of it represented capability that would be desperately needed in the battles still to come. When Allied forces pushed toward the German border and encountered the Siegfried Line fortifications, they faced defences weakened by what had been thrown away at Aracourt. The man directing Germany's war from Berlin flew into one of his characteristic rages when reports of the defeat reached him, looking for scapegoats to blame for a failure that stemmed from his own strategic decisions. Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G, was relieved of command, made the fool guy for an offensive that had been doomed from its conception. But firing Blaskowitz changed nothing about the fundamental realities. Germany had gambled scarce armoured forces on an operation that had no realistic chance of success, and the gamble had failed spectacularly. For the Americans, victory brought both pride and frustration in nearly equal measure. Pride because they had faced Germany's best and not merely survived, but triumphed decisively. The 4th Armoured Division had proven its quality beyond any doubt, had demonstrated that American tankers could fight and win even against opponents with superior equipment. Frustration because the victory, complete as it was, couldn't be exploited. Supply shortages that had plagued Patton's advance before Aracourt grew even worse afterward. The decision by Supreme Allied Command to prioritise Montgomery's northern advance meant that fuel and ammunition continued to flow toward British forces, while Patton's Third Army scraped by on whatever could be spared. American tankers who had just shattered a major German offensive found themselves sitting in place, unable to advance, not because the Germans could stop them, but because their own supply situation wouldn't support a continued offensive. The road into Germany lay open, German defences in the sector were in disarray, and Patton's forces couldn't move because their tanks were dry and their ammunition lockers nearly empty. For soldiers who had fought so hard and lost comrades in the fighting, watching the opportunity slip away was bitter medicine. They understood the larger strategic picture, understood that supplies were limited and had to be allocated based on overall Allied strategy, but understanding didn't make the frustration any easier to bear. Back home in the United States, newspapers trumpeted the victory once details were released for publication. Headlines proclaimed how American Shermans had destroyed hundreds of German Panthers, how brave tankers had overcome superior German technology through skill and courage. The stories, while simplified and sometimes exaggerated in the way wartime reporting often was, captured something true about what had happened in Lorraine. This wasn't a victory won through overwhelming material superiority. The United States obviously had that in the larger sense, but in this specific battle the Germans had brought more and better tanks. This was a victory won through better training, better tactics, better use of combined arms, and the kind of battlefield adaptability that only experience could teach. American families reading these accounts felt pride in what their sons and husbands and brothers had accomplished, felt reassured that despite the setbacks and struggles, American forces were proving themselves capable of meeting and defeating the German military. Within the military itself, Aracourt became a case study, an example taught to new officers and used to illustrate principles of armoured warfare. The lessons were examined and re-examined, dissected in after-action reports and staff studies, turned into doctrine that would influence American armoured tactics for years to come. Individual soldiers who had fought at Aracourt carried their own memories and lessons forward. Creighton Abrams, whose 37th Tank Battalion had performed so brilliantly, continued his rise through the ranks, his leadership recognised and rewarded. He would eventually become one of America's most respected armour commanders, his name forever associated with the kind of aggressive, intelligent tank warfare that had won the day in Lorraine. Decades later, when the United States developed a new main battle tank to replace the aging M60, they named it the M1 Abrams in his honour, a fitting tribute to a man who had proven the decisive factor in armoured combat was the commander, not just the machine. Major Charles Carpenter, the artillery spotter who had jury-rigged bazookas onto his Piper Cub and attacked Panthers from the air, became something of a legend. His story was told and retold, growing perhaps slightly more dramatic with each telling, but never needing much embellishment because the truth was extraordinary enough. He represented the kind of American ingenuity and individual initiative that senior commanders valued, the willingness to see a problem and improvise a solution rather than waiting for someone else to fix it. For the ordinary tankers of the 4th Armoured Division, Aracourt became part of their unit's identity, a battle honour that distinguished them, proof that they were among the best armoured formations in the American Army. The German soldiers who survived Aracourt and lived through the remainder of the war carried their own memories, though these were darker and more painful. They had been sent into battle with promises of victory, told their Panthers were invincible and that they would drive the Americans back in confusion and defeat. Instead, they had experienced the terror of fighting blind in fog, of being ambushed repeatedly, of watching their supposedly superior tanks burn around them, of retreat and defeat and the bitter knowledge that they had been sacrificed in an operation that should never have been attempted. Some blamed their officers for poor planning, some blamed the madman in Berlin for refusing to accept military realities, some simply blamed their own bad luck for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What they couldn't deny, even if pride made them reluctant to admit it openly, was that they had been outfought by an enemy they'd been taught to view as inferior. The Americans hadn't won through luck or overwhelming numbers in this particular battle. They'd won through superior skill, better coordination, and the kind of tactical flexibility that German forces in late 1944 could no longer match. In the broader context of the war, Aracourt's significance extended beyond the immediate tactical results. It confirmed what other battles had been suggesting, that the tide had turned irreversibly against Germany, that Allied forces were no longer just numerically superior, but had achieved qualitative advantages as well. American and British forces had learned how to fight, had developed doctrine and gained experience, had built the kind of combined arms capability that could defeat even technologically advanced opponents. Germany's window for achieving anything like victory had closed, if it had ever truly been open after the defeats in Russia and North Africa. What remained was the grim mathematics of attrition, Germany wearing itself down against opponents who could replace losses and continue advancing, while German losses were increasingly irreplaceable. Each battle like Aracourt accelerated this process, consuming German strength without achieving anything to compensate for the losses. The men fighting on the German side, at least those clear-eyed enough to see the larger picture, understood they were fighting for survival now rather than victory, trying to delay the inevitable rather than reverse the course of the war. For the French civilians who had lived through the battle, Aracourt represented another chapter in a long history of their homeland being fought over. Lorraine had seen wars for centuries, French and Germans killing each other across these same fields generation after generation. The villages bore scars from 1944 that joined older scars from previous wars, layers of damage and reconstruction that told the region's violent history. But this time, at least, the fighting had moved on relatively quickly, the battle resolved in days rather than dragging on for months or years. Families emerged from cellars where they'd sheltered during the worst of the combat, assessed the damage to their homes and farms, and began the slow process of rebuilding. Some had lost everything, their houses destroyed in the fighting, their livestock killed, their fields turned into cratered wastelands. Others had been luckier, escaping with minor damage, able to resume their lives once the armies moved on. They buried the dead, soldiers from both sides who would rest in French soil far from their homes, and they tried to forget the sounds of battle that had terrorized them. Today, more than 80 years after the guns fell silent, Lorraine is peaceful farmland again. The craters have been filled, the wrecked tanks hauled away for scrap decades ago, the trenches and foxholes ploughed under and planted over. Villages destroyed in the fighting have been rebuilt, often with little indication of what happened there in 1944. Farmers work fields where Panthers and Shermans once duelled, where men died in the fog, where the course of the war was influenced by a battle most people have never heard of. There are small memorials here and there, monuments to the soldiers who fought and died, maintained by local communities who haven't forgotten even if the wider world has moved on. Veterans organizations occasionally organize tours, elderly men returning to walk ground where they fought in their youth, pointing out locations that remain vivid in their memory even as the physical landscape has changed beyond recognition. For historians and military professionals, Aracourt remains significant as a case study in armoured warfare, an example of how tactical skill and combined arms coordination can overcome technological disadvantages, how training and experience matter more than specifications on paper. The lessons of Aracourt echo forward into modern military thinking, even though the specific technologies have changed dramatically. The principle that superior individual weapons don't guarantee victory remains valid, as does the understanding that integration of different military capabilities produces effects greater than the sum of individual parts. The importance of training, of giving soldiers and leaders time to develop skills and cohesion before committing them to combat, was proven brutally in Lorraine, where green German crews in advanced tanks were slaughtered by experienced American crews in supposedly inferior vehicles. The value of reconnaissance and intelligence, of understanding the battlefield before committing forces, was demonstrated by the German failure to properly scout American positions and the disasters that resulted. The need for adequate logistics, for ensuring forces have the fuel and ammunition to sustain operations, was highlighted by German tanks sitting immobile while American forces manoeuvred against them. These aren't lessons unique to Aracourt, they've been learned and relearned throughout military history, but the battle provided particularly clear examples of each principle. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Aracourt is the simplest and most fundamental. In war, the quality of men matters more than the quality of machines. The Panther was objectively a better tank than the Sherman by almost any technical measure. It had thicker armour, a more powerful gun, better protection for its crew. On paper, Panthers should have dominated Shermans. In the fields of Lorraine, those supposed advantages proved worthless because the men crewing the Panthers didn't have the training or experience to exploit them, while the men in the Shermans had learned how to overcome their tanks' deficiencies through superior tactics and teamwork. No amount of advanced technology can compensate for poor training, inadequate doctrine, or inexperienced leadership. Conversely, well-trained forces using sound tactics can achieve victory even when their equipment is inferior. This truth has been proven repeatedly throughout history, but it's one that each generation seems to need to relearn, that gets forgotten in peacetime when the focus shifts to acquiring the latest and greatest technology, only to be rediscovered in combat when those expensive systems prove less decisive than their advocates promised. The fog that had shrouded Aracourt in September 1944 eventually lifted, both literally and figuratively. The weather cleared, allowing the full scope of German defeat to be visible. And over time, as records were examined and histories written, the significance of what happened in those French fields became clearer. It wasn't the largest battle of the war, wasn't the most famous, didn't involve the dramatic reversals of fortune that characterized some other engagements, but it was a nearly perfect example of how battles are won, not through possession of superior weapons, but through superior use of available resources, not through following rigid plans, but through adapting to circumstances, not through individual heroics alone, but through teamwork and coordination. The American victory at Aracourt stemmed from all these factors working together, creating a synergy that German forces couldn't match despite their technical advantages. For the men who fought there, who survived the fog and fire and chaos of September 1944, the battle remained a defining moment of their lives. Some carried physical scars, wounds that never fully healed. Others carried psychological scars, memories of friends lost, of moments of terror, of sights and sounds that haunted dreams for decades. But they also carried pride, the knowledge that when tested they had measured up, that they had faced a dangerous enemy and emerged victorious, that their service had mattered. The battlefield itself has moved on, as battlefields always do. The ground doesn't remember what happened there, doesn't carry the weight of history that humans attach to it. The fields produce crops, the villages house families, life continues in the mundane rhythms of peace. But the story of what happened there in September 1944 remains preserved in documents and memories and history books, a reminder of a moment when the outcome of battle hinged not on technology or numbers, but on the skill and determination of men fighting from disadvantaged positions. Aracourt proved that victory isn't inevitable for the side with better equipment, that wars aren't won by specifications and statistics, but by the human factors that are harder to quantify but ultimately more decisive. In an age that often seems to worship technology, to believe that the next advancement will be the one that finally makes warfare scientific and predictable, Aracourt stands as a corrective, a reminder that warfare remains fundamentally human, that it's shaped by courage and fear, skill and mistakes, determination and exhaustion, all the messy realities of human beings under extreme stress making life and death decisions. The fog has long since lifted from those French fields, but the lessons revealed when it cleared remain relevant. Technology matters, equipment matters, but they matter less than the soldiers who employ them and the doctrine that guides their use. Training and experience provide advantages that can't be purchased or manufactured. Combined arms coordination multiplies effectiveness in ways that focusing on individual capabilities can't match. Flexibility and adaptation matter more than rigid adherence to plans. These aren't revolutionary insights, they're principles that military theorists have articulated for centuries. But Aracourt provided a particularly clear demonstration of each one. The battle that was supposed to showcase German armoured superiority instead became an object lesson in why wars are won by armies rather than weapons, by systems rather than technologies, by men rather than machines. And that, perhaps, is why Aracourt deserves to be remembered, not because it was the biggest battle or the bloodiest, but because it taught lessons that remain valuable, that challenge comfortable assumptions about military power, that remind us that in war, as in so much of life, success comes not from having the best tools, but from making the best use of whatever tools are available.